A UFO crash site. Researchers investigate a decades-old story of a reported UFO crash near Aztec, New Mexico. Just months after Roswell, the craft at Aztec was covered up in a far more secret manner, and only through the bold actions of journalist Frank Scully do we know about the story today. But controversy surrounds Aztec, with some claiming it's a hoax, and others a coordinated cover-up of one of the wildest UFO cases of all time.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Eli Watson. Today we're going to be discussing UFOs once again. Now, if you've been following this show for a little while, you might remember my two-part episode on George Adamski, the famous UFO contactee. And even earlier than that, the second episode of this series, I focus on my personal investigation into a UFO cult that used to exist in my hometown of Temecula, California. The reason I bring up these episodes is because they provide a lot of the backdrop of what we're going to be discussing today, which was a crash that happened somewhere outside of Aztec, New Mexico in 1948. So harkening back to those earlier episodes, the event that really kicked off the flying saucer craze was Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947. Kenneth Arnold was a pilot who witnessed several craft in the air with him that he could not identify. And as they traveled at extremely fast speeds, which was way too fast for any known aircraft at the time, he said that they appeared to be skipping, almost as if you threw a saucer across water. And the journalists took that description and made flying saucer, and that's where the term flying saucer comes from. Well, that encounter happened in June of 1947, and it was only about a month later when perhaps the most famous event in ufology occurred, which was the crash in Roswell, New Mexico.
Now, the story of Roswell is really perplexing, and I think it still remains sort of a cornerstone of modern ufology. But the finer details essentially are this, that sometime prior to the early days of July, maybe within the last few days of June, a farmer named Mac Brazel had been out on his remote ranch near Roswell, New Mexico, and he starts discovering all of this wreckage, this debris of some kind that's really spread out over his property. He actually ends up cleaning up a lot of this debris, and he kind of tucks it away under some brush and everything and sort of forgets about it. But one day he's driving into town and he hears and sees in the newspapers all this discussion about flying saucers. A pilot over Mount Rainier had observed these flying saucers. What are these things? A Soviet weapon or something else? Well, Brazel, remembering all the stuff, all this clutter that he'd cleaned up off of his field only days beforehand, he goes, well, gosh, I wonder if this could be one of those flying saucers. And so he goes to the sheriff and he says, listen, I may have something that's of interest to the military. And so they contact Roswell Army Airfield, and the intelligence officer on the base is sent out there with Brazel to investigate. Now, that intelligence officer was Jesse Marcel. And he basically was the guy on the base whose job was to know all the aircraft that we have. He had all the intelligence with regard to what the Soviets might have had, the likelihood that Soviet surveillance or any kind of efforts to try and surveil sensitive military sites like the Roswell base, for instance, might have been underway by the Soviets, whether that involved aircraft or balloons or anything else. Jesse Marcel goes out there, he observes the wreckage, there's a cleanup operation, and it's initially reported to the press that indeed a flying disc had been acquired there at Brazel's ranch. But the next day, a very different story is published in the Roswell Daily Record, where it's reported General Roger Ramey has emptied the Roswell saucer, it's only a weather balloon. Well, many years pass. Basically, UFO researchers report the Roswell incident as a misreport or a hoax or just bad journalism. They'd gotten ahead of the game and they reported a flying disc was captured and they hadn't properly vetted the entire story. But then a civilian researcher and a nuclear physicist by the name of Stanton Friedman is doing the rounds. He's traveling around. He is becoming one of the best known proponents of a UFO reality on the lecture circuit. And in the late 1970s, he is in Louisiana and he's doing a television interview about UFOs. And one of the staff there at the station says, there's a retired Air Force gentleman here who lives in town who was involved in that incident back in 1947. He said that there was a flying disc that was captured and you should talk to him. And so Stanton, of course, was like, well, where can I find him? So they put him in touch with, of course, this turns out to be Jesse Marcel. And Jesse recalls, it was my job to know all the aircraft we had. Whatever we cleaned up out there on Brazel's ranch, that was not anything that I was familiar with. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. So Stanton Friedman and his research, along with research that was conducted by William Moore, really kind of formed the cornerstone for the reinvestigation into the Roswell incident. And for the first time in decades, UFO researchers began to say maybe this wasn't just a misidentification of a weather balloon, maybe there really was a there. Jesse Marcel seemed to think so. So in 1980, William Moore, based partly on that research that he and Stanton Friedman had done, they co-author a book, Moore and then the popular occult writer Charles Berlitz, called The Roswell Incident. And again, there's very little said in that book about the recovery of bodies or anything like that. It's just describing some sort of a disc, some sort of an aircraft that crashes. But after that book's published, it went off like an atom bomb. A lot of civilian researchers got into the game. Don Schmidt, Kevin Randall, and others. Stanton Friedman also would publish a book, and Stanton looked not only at Roswell, but he also had made the argument that maybe the Aztec incident had been the real case that should be examined, or maybe the Corona crash.
I would say the state of ufology before Roswell was non-existent. Nobody was talking about UFOs. And then all of a sudden, something crashed in the desert and the world went nuts. Seriously, like the entire world went UFO crazy. And that's when the government said, we gotta stop this. If the world knew that Americans were concerned about our skies not being safe, that's a problem. So, 1948 comes, they start their first official investigation into UFOs to try to put an end to that craze, and they failed miserably.
So in 1948, the US government formed what was called Project Sign, established by Air Force General Nathan Twining. Project Sign's mission was to gather, evaluate, and distribute within the government all information relating to this UFO or flying saucer phenomenon. Project Sign later became Project Grudge. Project Grudge later became Project Blue Book, which everybody knows. However, each of those projects had different purposes, with some outright trying to discredit the UFO phenomenon entirely, which raises some questions about what the government might know about UFOs that they don't want the public to know. I also think it came about at an interesting time, because you have this great fumble at Roswell, where at first they say it's a flying saucer, and then they say, oh, just kidding, no it's not, it's actually a balloon. There's nothing to look at here, but we're going to form a small group within the government whose job it is to look into every single UFO case that happens in this country. But to play devil's advocate, there are some actually legitimate reasons as to why the US government would look into the UFO phenomenon in the first place, especially in those early days.
If something is not only visiting our planet and breaching our skies, our borders that we've put up, but now crashing, that's extremely concerning. And the fact that it happened in America means that it could be happening in other countries. So what happens if Russia is in possession of a craft that they've recovered from a UFO crash? What about us? What technology do we now have from that crash? What technology does Russia have? So I do think there probably is some sort of shadow Cold War that has always happened when these UFOs crash. Who gets it? Who's gonna discover and understand the technology behind these crashed craft first? Because whoever does figure that out, game over. I mean, at that point.
However, there are some missing pieces to the story. Roswell happened in July of 1947. Project Sign began in April of 1948. So a logical question to ask is, what happened in between? In March of 1948, a flying saucer crashed outside of Aztec, New Mexico. This event was covered up so quickly that few people have ever heard of it, and those who have believe that it is most likely a hoax. In fact, when you Google the Aztec, New Mexico UFO crash, the very first thing that comes up, the Wikipedia page, refers to it as a hoax.
Long before Roswell would be revisited in the late 1970s, and then a book by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, The Roswell Incident, was published in 1980. Long before all that, this story of the Roswell crash kind of had a corollary in what was known as the Aztec UFO crash. In fact, there are some proponents even in more recent years who tried to argue that, well, Roswell, it was indeed a hoax or whatever, but the Aztec crash was the real UFO crash that occurred. But again, this had been a story that had been largely popularized by authors at the time like Frank Scully. And unfortunately, Scully's sources were less than reputable. In fact, many of them were later exposed to be obvious hoaxers, and Scully had done very little fact-checking when he published these accounts. But it's interesting because prior to Roswell really gaining foothold in the 80s and 90s as being the potential smoking gun evidence of a crash wreckage retrieval and government's knowledge of there being a UFO reality and even being in possession of some of the equipment that the extraterrestrials are using, those speculations in many ways actually began with that earlier case where allegedly near Aztec, New Mexico, in very similar fashion, there was a crash that occurred. And there are some today who still try to champion it and say that was the real incident involving a UFO crash that our government covered up.
Now, you might be wondering why I'm going to spend an entire episode talking about presumably what is a hoax. But I think this episode, more than any of the other episodes I have made thus far, presents an amazing case about why you shouldn't take a story at face value and the value of historical research, especially in a field like ufology. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of all the juicy details of this story, I want to introduce two wonderful people that I met while making this documentary. That being Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. Scott and Suzanne have spent decades researching the Aztec UFO incident. They, more than most people I know, have done their due diligence to look into this historical case and learn as much as they could about this one particular incident. And I think once they have said their piece, that there won't be any doubt in your mind that something did in fact crash at Aztec, New Mexico, and then was subsequently covered up. And we'll also see a coordinated effort to discredit Frank Scully, an attempt which has been successful even to this day. And this is no diss to Micah Hanks. I love Micah Hanks. But the research that Scott and Suzanne have done is truly nothing to sneeze at.
I'm Suzanne Ramsey, and I am a co-writer with my husband Scott and Frank Thayer of the Aztec books pertaining to the Aztec UFO incident. I own and manage a root beer company here in North Carolina, and then I also co-manage our little organic farm that we make produce on. So that pretty much sums it up.
I'm Scott Ramsey, Suzanne's husband. I've been researching the Aztec UFO crash for 36 years. And my full-time job that helps pay for all this research is I am the Southeastern Sales Manager for Pittsburgh Electrical Installation, out of Munhall, Pennsylvania. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And Suzanne and I, of course, farm the farm here. I was in Farmington, New Mexico back in October of '88, and we were late night testing a generator, and two of the employees were talking about what they were going to do that weekend. And one said he was going to go out and look for a spot to hunt mule deer or white-tailed deer off Old Hard Canyon Road. And the other gentleman said, well, where about? I'd like to join you. So I'll be out by the old crash site. I didn't know these gentlemen at all. Matter of fact, I just met them that afternoon. And I said, hey, I'd love to hear more about this crash site. I'll buy the beer if we all go over there for an end of the day nightcap. And I heard what they knew about the UFO crash, which wasn't much. It was basically a lot of the story passed down through many generations. They drew me a map on a bar napkin about how to get out there. Somehow my rental car and I got out there, and I don't know if I made it to the right mesa, but I found Hard Canyon Road and kind of acclimated myself with it pretty good. The second trip was January of '99. And at that time, we did find what we call today the crash site, what the locals call the crash site. And I guess what the federal government calls the crash site. Something crashed at that crash site. So that kind of sparked my interest. Why have we not heard about Aztec, but the whole world knows about Roswell?
I, as a child, grew up in a home that was pretty open-minded. We had lots of colorful conversations around the dinner table. My mother happened to be reading, it must have been a used book, because I'm not as old as the crash site, but we were eating dinner one night and she began talking about a book that she was reading by the author Frank Scully. And it was the original information about the Aztec incident. So each night we would hear what she had to say about what she had read. And so that was my first introduction to it. And then I really didn't give it much thought. I guess I always just assumed that there were other things, other places. You know, I just never questioned it. I assumed it was just a fact. And so years later, when my parents decided to move south, they moved from South Dakota, where it was very cold, to New Mexico. And my mother said I would love to move to Aztec because I love the story and I'd like to know more about it. I was already moved out of the house. I came back and helped them move to Aztec in Flora Vista. That's right there in the area. And she was grossly disappointed because no one wanted to talk about it, and had just felt like I moved here because I really wanted to know more about this, and no one has an interest, and it's actually pretty closed mouth. So, and then with my radio show, I would interview a variety of people. So many interesting people that have shared their stories with us, both when I had the radio show and then as well as since we've been researching, and so many of them are so heartfelt and so caring, and so you can see that something definitely has impacted their life. And it's been a fascinating path.
Another thing to consider is where the country was at the time, not just in terms of UFO history, but just general history coming off of World War II, the invention of the atomic bomb. All of these things are very, very important because we're looking at a very different world than the one that we live in today.
We had just come off, 3 years earlier, the World War II. The atomic bomb was built at Los Alamos. It was tested at Trinity Site down at White Sands, New Mexico. New Mexico then, as it is today, is heavily reliant on military and government funding. You've got Sandia National Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, Holloman Air Force Base, the list goes on. And White Sands is still alive and well and testing everything you can imagine.
I think also New Mexico, a lot of it hasn't been unchanged.
Yeah.
There's sparse population. Of course, you have your major cities and things, but there's some pretty rough and rugged roads, certainly beautiful scenery, but a lot of things are very similar to the way they were. Now, at the time of this incident, there were barely phones, and they were intermittent in the area.
And very expensive.
And very expensive. And there was a lot of open space. And one of the things that, having lived in New Mexico, I can say with joy is the sky is blue almost every day of the year. And it is so vast. And even in a city, you still can see the stars generally. It is so vast, the sky, and so beautiful. And it's unlike so many places in the world. So in that way, I don't think it's changed much.
And all of that leads us to one fateful day in Aztec, New Mexico. But the story begins just outside of Aztec in nearby Cuba, New Mexico.
The UFOs and green orbs have been sighted a lot in the year of 1948 leading up to March, to the point where two law enforcement officers would meet every night down in Cuba, New Mexico, and discuss what they were seeing and comparing notes. That was Andy Andrews and Manuel Sandoval. And they finally got to the point, they said, this is insane. We need to track one and stay on it and find out more about it.
There had been many, many sightings in the area, both
Leading
military at Los Alamos as well as in Cuba, New Mexico, many, and reports filled out by citizens, and they brought in a scientist, Lincoln La Paz, to try and figure out what these were, and that was a shambles. And they really were getting to the point that every day they were filling out forms, and every day they were seeing these craft, and it was washed off by the government, saying in Lincoln La Paz that it was just meteorites. It enraged the people of Cuba, New Mexico so much, and the law enforcement, because they knew better. These would make turns, and they were structured craft. There's no way they were meteorites. And so they were so upset. And this brings us to this little cafe where they're having pie and coffee, and they're trying to figure out what they can do to be proactive.
So Manuel Sandoval tells Andy Andrews that next time I see one, we're going to follow it. Now, keep in mind, older Highway 44 was a 2-lane road. Today, it's a 4-lane road. Now it's Highway 550. And there are times that you're not going to keep on the tail of the flying saucer. You got canyons, we got mountain ranges and whatnot. We've kind of reenacted all that. And they ended up tracking it one night, right after they made their decision that they would do so. Andy Andrews went one direction, Manuel went the other, and Manuel Sandoval ended up in Aztec, where he lost it for a while, and then they picked it up again. It went over Valentin Archuleta's ranch, which is a 13,000 acre spread. It's a big ranch. And as it came over his ranch, it wobbled like a leaf. That's how he described it. And then it hit a canyon wall on his ranch. Sparks flew, and then it kind of went absolutely due north, as it turns out, and landed on the mesa that we now call the crash site. Valentin Archuleta had a phone and got rid of it, but down the road at the mercantile station and general store, there was a phone and a back door that was open for any rancher that needed a phone in the middle of the night or whenever. He called Kirkland Air Force Base and said, hey, these flying discs or whatever you call them that you're talking about all the time, one just hit the mesa behind my house. And they asked him what direction it was going. He said it was going due north toward Art Canyon Road. So that's kind of what was going on that night. 5 o'clock in the morning, give or take a few minutes, oil field workers were called out, and instead of going about their normal day, they were called to go out to Hart Canyon Road and investigate a brush fire, which turned out having nothing to do with the flying saucer. So they got out there, and other oil field workers had shown up as well, and they They looked around and saw that the brush fire was no threat to the oil drip tanks. There's a big storage facility of oil drip tanks. Once they were satisfied that the oil drip tanks weren't in danger, they were okay to go about their day. And some other oil field workers said, hey, whoa, wait till you see what's up on that mesa. So they went up, and here's this 99.9 foot craft laying on the top of the mesa.
So as people began to approach the craft, you have a 19-year-old Doug Noland and Bill Ferguson, who were called out to look at this brush fire. Noland described the craft as smooth, with no noticeable seams, rivets, bolts, or weld marks. It looked like it had been molded. It also appeared to be made out of brushed aluminum, and that there were windows or portholes on it. And these windows had a slightly mirrored surface, like you would see in mirrored sunglasses, so when you pressed your face close to the window, you could see into the craft. And when they did that, they saw these two bodies slumped over a control panel, and they realized that they needed to get in there and help whoever was hurt.
The craft was sitting there. The two oil field workers and then their other crews walked up to it to see it, and they were standing around it. Neighbor ranchers. There was a constable
from Aztec.
There was a sheriff there. A whole group of people were there. Two strangers that didn't live in the area. All of them were standing around it, and they were concerned with, what is this? And about this time, there is a helicopter that comes sweeping around. They were unsure which was more interesting to them, the helicopter or the UFO. Now, clearly today we'd say UFO, but helicopters were just being introduced to, the public at that time. So this was all around exciting day for everyone there, believe me. One of the oil field workers, they found as they crawled on the disc, a hole about the size of a quarter in one of the windows that
portal.
And ran to his vehicle and grabbed a long pole, and they took the pole and jabbed it in there and kept jabbing through the hole until it opened. The craft opened. So they didn't have to pry it or anything. It just opened. And they were able to go in. Several of them went in and started walking around. There were 3 floors to the craft. The top floor is where they entered, and there were 2 bodies slouched over in a seated position. And as you looked around, there were a lot of obviously electronic things. There were
what we would call today flat screen TV, which back then, the people out that area didn't even watch TV.
Exactly. They had almost like a paper-like book, and there were inscriptions in it.
And depending on who you talked to, there were 14 or 16 bodies, or 14 through 16 bodies in the craft.
Right, depending on who you talked to in terms of taking the bodies out. Some people only got to 14, but there was a total of 16 bodies. So then as they came out, about that time, the military got there, and the military made them swear that they wouldn't say anything to their family or to anyone. They all left. All of the witnesses then left and went home. And up came a minister, a circuit minister that was driving by on the main road and saw a lot of activity and thought possibly there was a crash or an accident or something. And he pulled off and approached the military and said, "Is there anything I can do? Is there any way I can help?" And they said, "Yes." So he got out of his vehicle and they took him up the hill. He had no idea what he was going to see. And there he saw 16 bodies laying out on the ground. And they said, "Would you be able to say last rites?" And he said, "I'm Baptist, I'm not Catholic, I can't do that, but I could pray for them." So he went to each body and said a prayer over them. And they were between 3 and 4 foot long. They had on like a jumpsuit type of, in a powder blue. They were childlike in appearance, perfect teeth, and they were burned on the outside. And The minister got back in his vehicle after he left and was so shook up he had to drive to Mancos, Colorado, which is 60 miles away. Got into Mancos and went to the church, called some of his parishioners and said, I just need to talk to somebody. So they came over and they were friends of his, and he explained what happened. He was so upset, he started to cry. And they said, why are you crying? Did this, question your faith? What is it? And he said, no, just seeing those small bodies, childlike, all 16 dead. He said it was just horrific.
So obviously there's a lot going on, from happenstance witnesses to the opening of the actual craft to praying over 16 bodies of what very well might be extraterrestrials. There's a lot happening there. And we'll return and discuss more of these interesting pieces here, but I want to focus on something that I find very, very fascinating about this case, which is the fact that there's an actual designated mark on the map where this occurred. There is an actual crash site. And in March of 2023, I and my good friend Jason Udis, along with another man, Mike Padilla, visited the Aztec UFO crash site.
Did you guys get a chance to go to the ruins?
No, not yet.
No.
What is that?
It's an ancient pueblo, Anasazi Pueblo,
Okay.
in correlation with Chocolate Canyon.
We're following the boys now. Going to a UFO crash site. Is this it?
Over here.
But this is the mesa where it happened.
Yeah. Down on bottom there is right above, that's where the battery of drip tanks were.
Okay.
And the oil fire was somewhere up here on top, and that's why they called in a crew.
Right. That's
Put out
right.
the fire. And the guys that were already out here that reported the fire were the ones that actually found the craft first.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it was just a happenstance. And then more people started showing up little by little.
So where is Mr. Archuleta's ranch, and which way did the craft come in?
Over this big hill right here. That's Hart Mountain?
Yep.
That's Hart Mountain right there.
That one right there.
That big is up on top. There's the heart, man.
Okay.
Okay, over that, we'll take you towards Blanco, New Mexico. And that's the area where Mr. Archuleta lived. The thought is that it came over the mountain right there and bounced up off of these sandstones and ended up here.
Wow.
So there might be some evidence of a crash over there.
On that sandstone?
That sandstone cliff right there. So here's your slab.
And what's the significance of the slab? One interesting thing that we looked at is the concrete slab. Now on the surface, it's just a regular concrete slab, but when you pause to consider the location, then you start getting into theories as to why this concrete slab might be there. Now, there are some more skeptical takes on this concrete slab, which is one, that it's an oil well cap from the oil field days, or two, that it's a compressor pad, and so it kind of served as the base of this large compressor that might have been there one day. But there's a couple problems with all these oil explanations. The first and the foremost being that anything relating to oil would typically be near the oil. And so, as we know, there used to be oil tanks around that mesa back in the day. So if you're going to drill an oil well, you're going to probably go down the mesa and drill for oil there instead of drilling through the entire mesa and then underground to get to the oil. And we know that they drilled through the ground near the mesa, not on top of it. So while that might explain away these other theories as to what this concrete slab is, it kind of leaves us at a loss as to who put this concrete slab there and why. However, Mike had a theory as to what it could have been.
Okay, we have a lot of sandstone here, but then there's a lot of unsettled earth. So as they were using their crane to lift the craft, it kept wobbling. So they had to pour a concrete slab for one of the footers to stabilize it, so it wouldn't tip over as they were trying to lift the craft. The reports are that it was broken into 3 pieces. So they loaded it on 3 pieces, and they used this road to get back down to the main Hart Canyon Road.
After discussing the slab, we continued on to the crash site, where we found a plaque placed there by the Ramseys in 2007.
On the crash site.
Many people have tried to debunk it, but it's been proven, and documents have been released recently that show that there was a crash here and there were bodies recovered here. And we're here today to spread the word that not only was there a crash recovery in Roswell, 9 months later there was a crash recovery at Aztec, New Mexico, Hart Canyon, a place that is very dear to me and my brothers here, JD and Daryl. We all frequented this place during the spring and summers of the 60s when we grew up as kids in Aztec. And we spent a lot of time here. And all of our efforts here, we thought, were to gather items for my grandmother and their aunt, who made medicines out of yucca, out of sage, out of other plants that grow up here in the mountains. Little did we know that my grandfather was up here because of the UFO crash. I didn't know that until 1998. And then I started putting it all together. Yes, us boys were up here for something good for my grandmother and their aunt, but we were also up here because of the Aztec UFO crash.
So aside from the mystery slab and the alien that we found, there really isn't much to see at the crash site. There's no remnants remaining there. There's no little pieces here and there to find, because everything's been swept away through a process called re-landscaping. So Scott Ramsey spoke with a man named Fred Reed, who used to work for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, in the 1940s. Fred Reed and his team would go to these different plane crash sites and clean up and re-landscape. And so the whole idea behind that was because New Mexico was this kind of testing ground for new and experimental equipment. They didn't want any potential spies, Soviet spies, Chinese spies, coming into the country and finding all this destroyed stuff. They didn't want foreign intelligences to know what kind of technology we had. So, in April of 1948, Fred and his team were brought out to Aztec, New Mexico to do another cleanup job. At this point, whatever had crashed there was already gone. And so they were tasked with finding any cigarette butts, any cans, any MREs, just any human-made trash, and burying them 18 inches below the ground. On top of that, Fred came across the concrete slab, and not knowing whether it had to do something with the crash site or was there for some other reason, he decided to bury that as well. Interestingly, if they found something that could not be traced to a human origin, or people things, as Fred Reed says, it was to be delivered to this kind of collection facility that was there at the crash site. Additionally, there was security around the perimeter on various mesas that were there to secure and make sure that this crash site was cleaned up without anybody coming in to see who was there and what was going on. And after they had done all that, then began the work of re-landscaping, which Fred Reed describes as this process of removing any tracks that heavy machinery may have left there, replacing bent or broken trees, and basically making the whole area look like nothing had ever happened.
All these smaller ones, they think were planted.
You can see the smaller trees, and then the trees get bigger around it.
The general thought from ufologists during their reclamation, they did like many reclamation teams do. They clean up the site, they plant grass, plant trees. And that's what happened here.
And I think that's absolutely wild that that was people's jobs. Obviously, it makes sense for national security reasons, but the fact that there was a group of people who did that, and there's probably a group of people who do that kind of stuff today. I think that's absolutely insane that they can do that. The government really went out of their way to make sure that nobody had heard of this case. But here's the thing. We know that they removed the craft because Reed came in after the craft was already gone. So the question is, how did they move this 100-foot diameter craft out of there?
This was a multi-week process for cleanup. They came in and did an assessment, and then quickly they had the support groups come in. There was certainly people to work on the craft itself. The scientists came in. There were a variety of scientists, one for each specialty, to work on the craft and dissect it. There were people to clean up any of the damage and try to re-landscape the area.
The first big project was getting the craft out of it, and that was one of the challenges we had. And you got to think about a craft that's 99 and 99.99 feet across. If you reference that to pi, that's 314 feet around. That's a good sized craft. Frank Scully back in the 50s addressed that in his book, how the craft came apart in segments, knowing that that was going to be something we got challenged on. Okay, so you did all this research on Aztec, how the hell did they get it out of there? So we went and reenacted moving the craft. Probably the most expensive thing we did in all our research. And first we went and hired the best high-wide moving expert in the world. His name is Bill Metzger. He wrote a part of our chapter in the book. And Bill had done that all his life as a career.
And by that, they mean that when something needs to be shipped, a space shuttle, a generator, something of massive,
a turbine, something huge.
How do you get it from here to there worldwide? And so his job is to find the best way, and how do you go about doing that? He knows the best way to do those things, and the perfect person to move something that is so unusual.
And I know Bill was the best because he worked for my dad. That's what my dad did for his entire life. And so when it came time to pick the guy that had the most experience doing high-wide shipments, Bill was a phone call away. So we had Bill and his wife Pam meet us in Aztec, and got up the next morning, and for 7 days we did a whole topography of the site from there down to the main road. That we knew we had several obstacles we had to go through, and using pinch poles and everything Bill could think of, we got it out of there. And then we did a reverse and went back from the main road all the way back to the crash site to see if we missed anything, a different angle or whatever.
One of the really great things I think Scott and I were excited about, probably doesn't sound like it should be, but Bill had no interest in UFOs whatsoever.
Yeah, none.
And actually, when we discussed, before we told him what it was, he didn't really care. And that's exactly who you want to have. You don't want to have somebody who, yeah, we want to prove this. We want somebody that's going to be objective, because that's what our research is objective.
And by the way, I want to add a very important thing. Bill researched it for weeks before we met him in Aztec. The only thing we used was technology leading up to 1948. We didn't use any computers. We didn't use any high-tech equipment.
And the roads, we made sure that they were the exact roads that were in existence at that time. And that's the thing, when you document something back historically, you have to go back to that date, not what we have today, whether it's technology or it's the roads. So it was a very, very expensive trip. It was a very, very exhausting experience to do that, but it was so worth it. It was a very important detail.
Wait, so you guys actually built like a giant circle, or?
No. We use pinch poles.
Yeah.
So a pole going across would be basically 100 feet, and 18 feet high was the height of the craft, and using that.
Now keep in mind, when they moved the craft and when this incident happened, it was taken apart into multiple pieces.
Yeah, 4 pieces.
4 pieces, and so there were no nails, there were no screws, anything like that. It just fit together, and that's how you did not actually move the craft in one piece. You moved it in 4 pieces.
But still, some of those pieces are huge. The craft was held together with what people today, if you're into flying, racing cars, or farm equipment, we call pib pins. Have you ever heard of a pib pin? A pib pin has very, very tight tolerance. The wing of an Indy car or a Formula One car or an Indy car, they're held on by pib pins. The nose of a race car is held on by a pib pin. That way they can make a quick adjustment or remove the nose if it's involved in a minor crash, stick a new one on, and hold it in with a pib pin. It has a little ball you push. When you push down, the ball disappears. When you let off, the ball appears at the bottom, and that's what gives you your locking mechanism. I should actually have one for when we do things like this to hold up and show people how things move around.
And one question tends to follow another. And in this case, once they removed the craft from the mesa, where did they take it?
Suzanne and I found some people from Wright Pat, well, one person in particular, that was claiming that at least in 1957, the craft was in a hangar, building 828 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So by 1957, the craft in its entirety was sitting in a building newly built, still standing today, called Building 828.
It's worth noting that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, is said to be home to many UFO craft, and the bodies of occupants from said crafts. Now, before we go any further, I'm still wondering why the craft might have crashed in the first place.
There was a striking amount of crashes that happened before Roswell and after Roswell as well. So make of that what you will. I think that this was a time period where we had our Second World War kind of just wrapping up, where we could have destroyed everyone and everything, kind of did. And then you also have the time period of Oppenheimer and the first atomic bomb being created and ultimately detonated. So talk about like a beacon to whatever's out there.
This is my words, my opinion. If we're detonating nuclear weapons off in the desert of New Mexico, it must look like a big flash cube out in outer space. I think that and other things, traces of the radiation, would have probably drawn attention real quick to somebody about what are these idiots doing now? And that's kind of when the sighting started.
If we possess enough power to destroy our entire planet in the blink of an eye, I don't know how another intelligence who is aware of us would not be interested in that. Probably to make sure we don't do it to another planet or even ourselves. So yeah, I think that period of time is when all of these intelligences that might be out there started to be like, what's going on that little blue marble down there? And should we be concerned with it? So I would look at it that way. They were just coming in to be like, all right, you guys good? Like, you're not gonna do that again, are you? And ultimately we did. So that was the time period where a lot of UFOs were not only reported, but were reported crashing. How and why were they crashing? Your guess is as good as mine. Were they shot down? Why? If they're traveling from so far away, are they all of a sudden just, losing power once they get here? I don't know.
This is like after World War II, the beginning of the Cold War. So the skies of New Mexico, they thought would be a prime place for an invasion of the Germans or the Russians. So they had these radar installations to protect New Mexico because of Los Alamos, because of Sandia, because of White Sands. The reports are there was like a dime-sized hole in one of the porthole windows of the aircraft. And I think that was caused by the radar.
Really?
Yes. Wasn't necessarily ships colliding with each other like someone tried to say in Roswell. It was actually the radar from the different installations down there. Well, El Vado Lake from here as a crow flies is probably less than 100 miles. And it would have been pointed towards the Southland. Los Alamos would have been right up above where their installation was. So it would have been scanning the skies in that area when the craft came up from the Roswell, what would be like the Roswell, Albuquerque area this way.
Right.
And it ran into the radar signal, disabled it, and it just kind of cruised until it crash landed here.
And the radar was powerful enough to, I guess, break through the window? Or I guess...
Seemingly so.
Seemingly so. Because they probably don't use glass, I'm assuming.
I wouldn't think so.
And going even further into the speculative realm, it seems like there was a lot of UFO crashes in the 1940s. We have Roswell, Aztec the year after, Cape Girardeau in 1941, and that's just naming a few. But we don't see any UFO crashes in the present day. Why?
I would say the reason that we're not seeing as many UFO crashes is either they're happening and the cover-up efforts and retrieval efforts have become much more stealthy and they're able to keep it under wraps more, or the craft themselves have become akin to how not to crash on this planet. Maybe they now have manuals back on their planet saying, don't do this, turn this lever once you hit the inner atmosphere. I don't know. But it is very telling that we haven't heard about a lot of modern day UFO crashes. And that could have everything to do with maybe they're not even visiting anymore. Maybe their curiosity has waned and they're done with us. Yes, there's still UFOs reported every single day, but you're not hearing about these huge mass UFO sightings or abductions or crashes even.
If there were to be a crash, that I think that with some of first Roswell, that there was kind of some foolishness that happened, that they had trouble concealing it, and they didn't really get the story right, and they disclosed it and then retracted, and by the time Aztec came a year later, they were spot on. Let me tell you what, that was a well-oiled machine. The day after Aztec, the day after, there were rules and laws nationwide that changed. So some big things occurred, and I think that it might just be that they're able to cover things up much quicker now and contain things much quicker.
Speculation aside, because we're never going to know the answers to those questions, although they are fun to think about, I want to get back to the facts. Something crashed at Aztec, New Mexico in 1948, and then it was covered up and the craft was removed. And when I read Scott and Suzanne's second book, and then I spoke to them over Zoom, it left no doubt in my mind that that happened. Like, it's a fact, it happened. So why is it then that the Wikipedia page considers it a hoax? Well, all of that boils down to Frank Scully and his book, Behind the Flying Saucers.
Frank Scully was a writer, a philanthropist. He was an amputee. He was a very interesting man. I give those qualifications because you automatically start to paint a picture and then you're going to go completely in a whole different direction. This man was amazing. He wrote for all types of mediums. He was probably best known for Variety as well as ghostwriting for many people. Something that I think is interesting is that Frank was approached by the scientists that worked on the Aztec craft to share the story of Aztec. And you think of all the people, why? I think knowing who he was tells you exactly why they picked him. He was a person of integrity. When people would have problems or get into trouble or be in difficult times of their life, they would come to his ranch and stay. Whether it was famous people, Hollywood people, whoever it was, he would take them in and just care for them and keep their secrets. And so I think he had a reputation for being that exceptional person that could share this story. Not just everybody would do that. And even to his grave, he kept the names of the scientists secret. So Frank is the person that was approached to share the Aztec story, and he did it in a way that in the book that it is camouflaged. His writing is very colorful. It has a real melody to it, but he gave the facts and told the entire Aztec story. And as we have followed through researching it, we have not found anything that wasn't true.
Published in 1950, Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, is what broke the story of Aztec, New Mexico to the public, and actually was only the second book about flying saucers ever published, right after Major Donald Kehoe's book, The Flying Saucers Are Real. With how efficient and expedited that cleanup of Aztec was, it really seems unlikely that Scully would discover the story, having not been there himself. But we know he discovered the story, and we know how he discovered the story because he writes about it in his book, and it begins when he meets a man named Silas Newton.
Silas, I'll use the words of the FBI in Silas Newton's file, was never a man worth more or less than $20 million a year. Now, 1950, 1948, that's a lot of money today. Can you imagine what that was like back then? I don't even know what the equivalent would be. He was an oil man. He had a lot of people upset with him. They were jealous. He would come into areas like San Juan County, which is where Aztec is, and Farmington, and almost all the way down to Cuba. And when an oil company like the Phillips brothers, where we get Phillips 66 gas today, they would drill a hole and be happy with so many 100 barrels a day. And when the well started to slow, Silas would come along and say, "Hey, I'll buy the lease on that oil well." "Yeah, sure, go ahead. Here, take it." And then he'd make it even more productive than it was when the Phillips brothers owned it. This went on and on.
Silas Newton began writing Frank Scully in regards to an article he wrote for Variety magazine. Then, in 1949, Newton invited Scully out for a little foray out into the Mojave Desert, where he was going to test out one of his oil detection machines, which is called a doodlebug. I've done a little bit of research into doodlebugs. This is not my first time coming across a doodlebug, and I may talk about this in a future episode of Mysteries and Monsters, but I'm not exactly sure how to describe it other than a doodlebug is essentially like a slightly more complicated version of divining rods. Basically these kind of rods that you hold out to detect water below the surface, but this is kind of like a bigger machine, and it's used to detect oil or in the other case that I'm talking about, was used to detect gold. So it's not very scientific, but at the same time, it works. But Scully and Newton weren't the only ones out in the desert that day. There was another man there, a scientist, who Scully calls Dr. G to keep his identity hidden. Dr. G claimed that he was one of several scientists who were brought in to examine a flying saucer that had been recovered by the US government. Not only that, he claimed that the government had, I believe, 4 different flying saucers at that point in time. But what's interesting about the one that he claims that he personally investigated was that this one was retrieved at Aztec and was completely intact. So Dr. G claimed that he had had a government contract that lasted for 7 years, which ended the year previous in 1948. So the majority of his time he was working for the government during World War II in the field of magnetism, and that he helped create this machine called the magnetron. On top of that, Dr. G was very confident that the government itself was going to break the story of Aztec, or the story of these flying saucers in general, and that he kind of wanted to get a jump on it. And so he told Frank Scully everything, because Scully was a journalist, so that Scully could write a book on it. And so in Scully's book, he details a lot of the stuff that Dr. G told him, like that these saucers probably used some form of magnetism to be able to lift off the ground and fly through the air, which I find is very interesting because Adamski describes that principle as well. Bob Lazar has outright said that that's how these flying saucers work. He claims that the inhabitants of the craft were most likely from the planet Venus, though at 3 to 4 feet tall, they're a little bit of a far cry from what Orthon looked like, but it's still an interesting thought pattern nevertheless. He also tells Scully that he found these essentially books that had papers in them with all this writing on it that they couldn't decipher but assumed were navigational in purpose. And there's loads and loads more that he tells Scully. But here's kind of a skeptical question is, why was a top government scientist or former top government scientist hanging out with Frank Scully, a journalist, and Silas Newton, an oil man, in the Mojave Desert in 1949? Well, there's an answer to that, which is unusual, but actually makes a whole lot of sense. So, as I stated earlier, Dr. G's work in the government was about magnetism, hence the magnetron. However, prior to World War II, the leading reason to study magnetism was actually in ways of how magnetism could help discover oil. And through Scott and Suzanne's research, they discovered the unfinished autobiography of Silas Newton, in which he describes at length, apparently, his interest in magnetism and how it relates to him finding oil. And I believe he claimed that his doodlebug in some capacity used magnetism to identify this oil. So at some point, they must have met and discussed magnetism and how to find oil and whatnot. And so if they were friends prior to World War II, and now this is 1949, they must have been friends for going on a decade at this point. So, like I said, unusual, but it does check out. And so now the stage is kind of set. We know who's who, how everybody knows everybody, who broke the story to who. So let's dig into the drama, into what I believe was a coordinated effort to discredit Frank Scully. May I introduce J.P. Kahn?
Well, J.P. Kahn was a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle and came from a lot of wealth. He was the only child. His family settled in California before it was California. His grandmother's claim to fame, she was the first Caucasian baby born in California. His writing abilities were very good. He wrote under a pen name. He did a lot of old stories on the Old West. Knew of Frank Scully by reputation, and heard Scully had a lead on this UFO story, and convinced his friends that he had arranged a deal to buy the story. because he was a writer at the San Francisco Chronicle. Of course, there's two sides to every story. Frank Scully said, we never had a deal. He offered to buy it outright. And I told him that I would never consider selling the story. It was my story. It was a good story. And the scientist had come to me, not J.P. Kahn. When it became apparent that he had no story or ownership to the story, I think J.P. was very much embarrassed by the owner and his immediate boss at San Francisco Chronicle. That's when all hell broke loose, for the lack of a better word.
By this point, Scully's book was selling very well, which I'm sure only added fuel to the fire. So Kahn began to attack Silas Newton and his business partner, Leo Gebauer.
He was so well connected, he actually had an ear to J. Edgar Hoover. We have copies of the letter, by the way. The FBI does give those out, where he wrote J. Edgar Hoover and said that Frank Scully was spreading a very dangerous story about a recovered flying saucer and the scientists that worked on it and blah, blah, blah. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover had to react very quickly if the story was true or if it wasn't true. They didn't need a story like that spreading. And that's when they went in and looked into Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer and really created a smokescreen to make sure that story was either debunked, discredited, or shut up completely.
Kahn went to their investors to tell the investors that you guys are being conned, you guys aren't going to see any money from this, he's scamming you with his doodlebug machine, and that you're never going to see your return on investment in these oil wells. This riled up some of the investors enough that in October of 1952, charges were actually levied at Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. The first being interstate transportation of stolen property. The stolen property in question were the checks given to Silas Newton to invest into these oil wells that he took from Colorado to California in order to deposit into his bank account. The second charge was for what's called worthless machinery, meaning that the Doodlebug device was not a top secret device that was infused with the magnetic science that Dr. G was producing, but rather just a regular old oil detection device. The most interesting aspect of this whole thing, I think, is the fact that Scott and Suzanne, through their research, have discovered that the investors were actually receiving their royalty checks from the oil wells that they invested in while they were going to court, claiming that Silas Newton and Dr. Leo Gebauer were scamming them and conning them out of those royalty checks that they were receiving. Kind of an interesting fact. So it's unclear and somewhat speculative as to why the court ruled in the direction that it ruled in. Either way, that's what happened, and Newton and Gebauer were arrested, and Scully's story thoroughly discredited. The narrative now became that instead of Frank Scully breaking this phenomenal story, it was Frank Scully had been duped by two con men, and his story is totally bunk.
When you go on the internet and you look at the Aztec incident, about 50% of the time you'll see that it's a hoax. And you think, well, there's got to be something to that. If you've ever watched a movie and you get to 3/4 of the way through it, and then for some reason you either turn it off or you have to leave the movie, and in your mind you think you know where the story's going, so you think you know that it's going to be one way. But years later, if you go back and you watch the end of the story, it's totally different. And so what I'm saying is, if you don't watch the whole story all the way through, you're not getting the story. And I feel like the folks that proclaim Aztec to be a hoax, that's exactly what's happened is they do not follow it all the way through. They end about 3/4 of the way with Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. They don't continue all the rest of it, all the other facts and information. So they come to an assumption, but they have no facts to base it on.
And unfortunately, no matter what the facts are, public perception is everything. And the public perceived that Scully had gotten mixed in with the wrong people, and he got duped. You know, Khan was an angry, bitter man because he didn't get this story. And his attempt to discredit Scully was successful, and it still is successful 70 years later.
J.P. Khan had, as Scott said, a lot of money, and he had the ways and means to never have to work. So he could really go about orchestrating this cover-up and embarrassment to everyone. He could spend all day long doing that.
He was a very bitter person all the way to the end. He still, almost the day he died, he was still upset that Frank Scully had reneged on his deal to sell him the story. The whole Aztec story, the debunkers try to lead you to believe that Silas Newton was a con man, so was Leo Gebauer, and they were selling little doodle bugs to oil researchers trying to find oil, and got caught up in a big scam over it and went to jail. Well, the fact of the matter was the two were kind of mishmashed together to discredit Frank Scully's story. And you know, when you look at how it was set up with J.P. Khan and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, I think it was, well, Scully blew the lid off this story that we didn't want blown off. And now we got to end the story by discrediting the people involved. But, you know, you get some really hardcore, old-time UFO people in that mix. And a lot of them have come over. Ted Phillips has come over to appreciate the Aztec. Ted Phillips and Stan Friedman been to the crash site. Timothy Good, they've all been to the crash site. When they look at the research, they say, nope, you know, this is a real case.
Aside from the work of all these wonderful researchers, the Aztec UFO story has remained alive in other ways, namely the Aztec UFO Symposium there in Aztec, New Mexico, which was started, I believe, in 1998 with the intention of raising funds to build a new library there in Aztec, which was successful, by the way. The event ran for about 14 years, and it hasn't been held in some time, although I know Mike Padilla wants to revive the event, and hopefully this documentary helps out a little bit in that. And hopefully the event can come back and introduce a whole new generation to the Aztec UFO crash, and also to Scott and Suzanne's amazing research.
My involvement with the Aztec UFO Symposium, I came in on the second year they ever did it. The first year I was there for a day in the audience listening to all the speakers. Second year I actually volunteered to help. And myself and Randy Barnes, we would go out and get big name speakers like a Stanton Friedman or Dr. Bruce Maccabee, people that had big recognition, and invite them to Aztec.
And we really focused on people that were research bound.
Yeah.
So they might have been bigger names, but the focus was, criteria was that they were research focused and based.
To draw people to do research at a library. What that did was drew a lot of world-class researchers to Aztec.
Yeah.
And a lot like Stan Friedman's like, hey, I hope you're not having me come out and talk about Aztec, because that's still in my gray basket. And I think Stan came a total of 6 times out of that 14 years. And he looked at the evidence and said, no, this case is real.
It's a part of history that should be celebrated. And I think that's what makes them unique. You know, they have the Anasazi ruins there, they have the pre-Pueblonians, they have so many things in that area. It's beautiful, the culture, but they also have this incident historically that they should celebrate.
Now, before we close out this episode, I just want to say that there's so much to this case that did not get discussed. I mean, seriously, there are so many details. There are so many little twists and turns in this story. I mean, seriously, just go read the book, The Aztec UFO Incident. There is so much meticulous information. There are so many details that I'm really, really convinced that if you read the book, you will be convinced that this was an actual historical event that actually happened. And it deserves to be looked at and considered part of UFO history as more than just a hoax, because this happened. But if 2 books isn't good enough for you, they are working on a 3rd.
We feel with the Aztec research, it is so complex. Again, you've got the pre-crash sightings, you have the military, you have the law enforcement, you have the actual incident itself, you have the cleanup, you have the scientists that worked on it, and then the cover-up. All those things are so important for this story, and really are just make it an intricate, beautiful story. In writing the first book, we put as much as we could in information. In writing the second book, we also did that, and that was published by a publisher. The third book, which we are working on now, will be considerably larger. It will have everything that we know and that we can prove. And if there's something that we cannot prove, which we've never done before, we will make a notation there of this is the theory that we have based on this. So we feel like it will be so comprehensive. The flow chart will start in the beginning of the book, and it will go through every witness. So many things that have never been in another book. Either they're new or we just couldn't fit them in. The second part of the book will be documentation and the research. So it will be almost like a school book. You will have your resources right then and there. We feel good in the fact that it will be prepared for future generations, as well as if someone else wants to continue the research or new things come up, which is very possible.
When speaking to them, they assured me that writing this 3rd book was very high on their priority list. And if it isn't out by the time this episode comes out, I'm sure it will be out at some point in 2025. Now, I have to confess, I didn't know much about the Aztec UFO crash before this episode. In fact, I hadn't heard of it at all. It was a matter of happenstance. I was going to New Mexico with Small Town Monsters. We actually filmed American Werewolves 2 there. And I wanted to do something while I was there. And we were staying in Farmington, New Mexico, and it was right next to this place called Aztec, and there's this thing called the Aztec UFO crash, and I'm like, why not? And I'm really, really glad I did. I've met some really great people working on this project, like Mike Padilla, like Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. And Scott and Suzanne are not only just great people, but they are fantastic historians. They are doing the real work that needs to be done. This story is a lot of he said, she said, and Scott and Suzanne really dug in deep. They found paperwork, they found letters, they found unfinished autobiographies, they interviewed people's friends, they interviewed people themselves over the course of 30 years to do their best to find out what exactly happened on that day in March of 1948. And I feel like we need more of that, especially in subjects like ufology and even Sasquatch research. We need more people who are digging into the facts, who are trying to piece these different narratives together to find out what actually happened, rather than people pursuing their own hypothesis. Well, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. And well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know I had a lot of fun making it, and I will see you in the next one.